I have some clapping that you'll be doing in a minute. So we're so pleased to host our fifth and final class of Margaret Metzger Fellows. There are now 30 Metzger Fellows in this world. Isn't that wonderful? May I ask all of the past Metzger Fellows here tonight to stand to be acknowledged so we can remember your awesome essays from the past? Can you stand up? I'd also like to welcome Margaret's family to the celebration. There's quite a few of them, so thank you very much for being here as well. As we know, the Margaret Metzger Fellowship honors a beloved Brookline educator and her mentorship of thousands of students as well as teachers. The Metzger Fellowship also celebrates what's important about education. As Margaret herself put it, the purpose of education is not just for a vocation, but for a quality of life. Being well educated, having an intellectual life, means that you do not bore yourself. Knowledge makes you interesting to yourself and others. Knowledge creates connections. Tonight we are connecting and celebrating Margaret and her vision, as well as these 6 educators from Runkle, Coolidge Corner, and Pierce Schools, as well as the high school. It is now my pleasure to introduce Margaret Metzger's son, Tell.
The 6 years since I last spoke with my mom feel like a very long time. My mom hated small talk and would famously spring an abrupt, "How's your soul?" on just about anyone. It was disorienting, and if you weren't game for that line of conversation, she'd lose interest. She loved stories and hated non-stories. My mom loved beauty, loved it with mischief and without apology. She carried scissors around with her to clip neighborhood flowers. In the car once, she asked me to pull into a nondescript parking lot behind a nondescript mall. "There's a beautiful cherry tree in bloom back here," she said as I noticed giant branch clippers laying in the back seat. I wasn't her lift, I was her getaway driver. "Don't stop the engine," she said as she hopped out. When I lost faith during college, she was the one I'd call at 2 a.m. I was anxious and didn't know how to honestly sort through the significance of an unstructured world. What do I do without a God? What is our life work here anyway? Unfortunately, my mom was exquisitely selfish. She never answered those 2 o'clock calls because it was 2 o'clock in the morning. She did not suffer fools, and she definitely didn't want to suffer. At her house for lunch, she might make you a cup of tea and bring you in close, or she might ask you to leave so she could take a nap. She might not show up at your house in Brooklyn the day she was visiting because she and Barbara decided to walk New York City's High Line. It's just a beautiful spring morning out here. She'd let us know joyously over the phone while the pile of fresh bagels sat uneaten on the counter. Her selfishness was, of course, a blanket. As her son, I enjoyed the warm side of that blanket, the side where she focused all of her attention. She would ignore the ringing phone or, terrifyingly, other cars on the road. She wrapped you up in her curiosity. She wanted to know. She always wanted to know. The first day she met my now wife, Mom asked her if I was good in bed. She demanded honesty and kept you dangerously unbalanced while she sorted through who you were, who you loved, how you loved. Before my mom died, Barbara asked friends and family to write to my mom. Thoughts, remembrances, letters, stories. It was an inspired request, and it's now my only advice to people with dying loved ones. Write them a letter. Just write it down. Organize your thoughts. Tell them you love them. Tell them what you are thinking. Tell them something. But be organized. Did I say tell? Show, don't tell. Be honest. Be raw. Be afraid. If you're going to write something down, make it count. She believed in words and hated words of nothingness. You better not small talk her. So thank you to Barbara and the Brookline Education Foundation for 5 years of giving teachers the time to tell their stories, the venue to do it, and the steady hand of John Andrews through the crafting of stories told with honesty. John, you had a special place in my mom's heart. Thank you for honoring it with such grace and such passion. Every year here, the audience is moved. I believe the writers are too. If that's not every English teacher's dream assignment, I don't know what is. Tonight we celebrate the teachers and administrators and staff of this remarkable Brookline system, and we celebrate educators through their stories. Mom would have loved this event. She knew a properly constructed essay could transport the reader and comfort the writer. She loved words like she loved the world around, and demanded that we use words to bring the world in close to us. At her burial, I did not have faith to turn to. Thankfully, Mom had surrounded herself with beauty and with people, and the people she had drawn in during her time of need then threw their blanket around me. On that beautiful spring morning, I found great comfort when Sue Stockard reminded us, as Mom's body was lowered below the surface, that she was returning to the earth that she so loved. These are, of course, only words, only stories, only comforting words to hold back our deepest existential fears. But these particular words also happen to be true. When we hold the world in close, our life work here will always return us home. The young son of a friend died a few years back. The words on his gravestone call to me as if from my mom. If Mom were here now, she'd admonish me for not digging deeper into myself. But as I get ready to steal an epitaph from a 1-year-old, I know her Midwestern gallows humor would delight. Don't be fooled, those Midwesterners are a dark bunch. And that the same mischievous twinkle would form in her eye as it would form when she clipped a flower from someone's yard. I think she'd appreciate this coming literary device, a little side shuffle that speaks love and that selfishly keeps me from bursting into tears on closing. It's a trick, really, to quote someone else's epitaph from my own mother. The gravestone reads, "He loved the sun and the trees and the wind in his hair," which sounds a lot to me like perfect instructions on how to engage the world with curiosity and beauty and selfishness and love. Thank you.
I want to thank the BEF. I want to thank Emily Dolbear and Liz Ascoli and the generosity of the BEF that took on this project, which wasn't necessarily their mission, but they found a home for us and they allowed us to do this work for the last 5 years. We greatly appreciate their generosity. I need to thank Barbara Kleeman, Abby Erdman, and Mary Birchnall, who sat with me in a room 6 years ago and said, how do we honor, how do we remember, how do we do something that captures the spirit of a friend and a colleague and a spouse and a mentor and an educator? And I think we've done a pretty good job. So thank you. And again, I need to thank all the previous people who participated, all those fellows who stood up before. It has been an honor to work with you in the past. Okay, let's get to tonight. Here we go. When Tell was in high school, Margaret wrote an essay, published an essay in Education Week about being a parent and how being a parent, quote, transformed her understanding of what it meant to be a teacher and what it means to be an adult. This summer, Murray Blau, who was a student of Margaret's in 1996 and now teaches 7th grade at the Coolidge Corner School, did some writing and thinking about the same question. I'm thrilled that we're starting tonight with one of Margaret's former students who's exploring that complex intersection of parenting and teaching.
Off script. I had spent hours preparing. I had my script printed and a few extra copies just in case I misplaced it throughout the afternoon. The first set of parents walked in the room. I gave them a big smile, a firm handshake, welcomed them to the center table, and launched into my script. Hi, my name is Miss Blau. My first few conferences went as planned. Then I started my conference with the Millers. I had their son's work ready to share, and I began to explain how William was doing in class thus far. However, this conference did not go as planned. The parents interrupted me as I began to share William's skills. They asked me to talk more about how they could support him at home. They had seen changes in him. They needed reassurance that their middle schooler would become someone they recognized again. They looked to me for guidance. So I pretended I had answers. but I was 23. I hardly knew how I was going to make it through my lesson the next day. How could I reassure them honestly that William would be okay? I thought it was best that I return to my script so that I could get back on with my agenda. For several years after meeting with William's family, I dreaded talking with parents. I didn't want to go off script. Although many parents enjoyed connecting over work samples and curriculum, others had concerns I couldn't speak honestly about. At that point in my life, I didn't know how to connect to or to understand each parent's anxieties about their children. Why couldn't they just let me lead the conversation? As the years went on, I gained confidence and experience in the classroom. I was also changing outside of work. I grew up, I got married, and in 2008, 7 years after I started to teach, I gave birth to twin boys. When I returned to teaching, I was different. Other than being utterly exhausted, I now viewed families through a different, broader, more compassionate lens. I realized that each parent was advocating for their child in the way they knew how. When a parent sent me an urgent email on a Friday afternoon, I took a deep breath and responded. When a parent asked me for an extension on an assignment that I didn't see the necessity for, I took a deep breath and agreed. When a parent blamed me for their child's low project grade, I took a deep breath and swallowed my pride. Breathe, Murray, breathe. We are all trying our best. This parent loves their child as much as you love your children. Breathe. When my children started kindergarten, it was clear that the vision I had dreamt about for our family was no longer our reality. I had recently become a single mother, raising 2 sons by myself. My life had derailed, and I was in survival mode. To help my children transition to their new school, I requested that they be placed in the same class. Although they were adjusting well to the school and our new way of life, I realized that my children needed help from the school they attended in ways I never imagined, as did I. That fall, I sat at the table during teacher-parent conferences as a parent. The teachers started to talk to me about their developing skills. I sat there half listening. She was telling me what I already knew, but I needed to know more. I needed to hear that my children were safe and known when they were away from me. I tried to find the right moment to share my concerns with the teacher, but she stuck to her script. We have a literacy group that will benefit their reading development, and I will start to separate them at lunchtime so they can begin to make new friends. I heard my younger teaching self in her words to me, and our time was up. As I was putting on my jacket and she was getting prepared for the next conference, I started to talk. Although I had practiced my words to her millions of times in my mind, I had never said the words out loud to a stranger. I needed her to know that I was scared, and I needed her to protect my children. However, as the words started to escape my mouth, I started to ramble. My anxiety spewed out of me uncontained. Please, don't dismiss the boys to their father if he shows up at school. They could be unsafe in his care. She smiled and pushed me out the door, reassuring me the boys were doing just fine. She didn't respond to the fear in my voice. I left the conference feeling humiliated and judged. When I walked into the room 60 minutes earlier, I was a poised and a competent mother, but I left feeling exposed. She had seen my mess. I wished that I could have taken it all back. Almost a year later, the night before the boys entered first grade, I received a text from that same kindergarten teacher. She wanted to let me know she was thinking of me and the boys since they were going to be separated into different classes for the first time the next day. She wanted to reassure me they were ready for their new independence, as was I. She wished us all a great new school year. I was brought to tears that on the night before school started, when a teacher's mind is flooded with the unknown of the next year, she was thinking about us. I thought she hadn't heard the fear in my pleas for help, but she had. She had protected them. She had protected us. Back in the classroom, as conferences approached, Meghan was one of our 7th grade team's greatest concerns. She was failing. She wasn't doing her homework. She was absent from school many days. This had been her pattern for years. But my team knew it was important that we try to get her back on track. We requested a conference with her mother so that we could go over our strategies to help Meghan. Before we could begin sharing with Meghan's mother our plan, she began to talk. In the outside world, Meghan's mom and I were seemingly nothing alike. But as she spoke, I became paralyzed. She wasn't talking about Meghan the student. She was talking about Meghan, her daughter. The story was messy, but Mom was vulnerable. She was exposing. She did not hide the details of her reality. She shared them to help her daughter. She was courageous. She became my role model. Meghan's mom knew about Meghan's incomplete homework. She didn't need us to tell her that, and she didn't need to use our time together to strategize how to get Meghan back on academic track. As I sat across from Meghan's mother, I felt connected. I had facilitated the parent-teacher conference countless times, but now it was different. Meghan's story could be my son's story. My own experience allowed me to sit across from that mother and be her ally. We both had an intense love for our children, and we were both trying to do our very best each day, but some days were harder than others. I pushed my notes aside and shared words of comfort and survival. I didn't need to stick to my printed script. I understood that my warmth and empathy was more important than any plan I had prepared. I knew I needed to restructure my conferences. Now, when I sit at the conference as a teacher, I know I need to interact differently with parents, especially the ones that I had once thought of as messy. The families that at one time I could not relate to were now me. Although it appeared I had my act together, I was messy. Their anxieties were my anxieties. I needed to give them reassurance that in the short time I had been teaching their children, they were known to me. But I also have to take the time to get to know the parents. What do they need from me? How can they trust me with their children? I need to put away the script and address the people in front of me. I now open with, what can you tell me about your child? What questions and concerns do you want me to address today? Although I am ready to discuss skills and show work samples, I let the parents lead the way. I need them to know I hear them and that I am there to protect them and their children, no matter what their story might be.
Thank you, Murray. Rebecca Hayden and Margaret Metzger shared an office for over 10 years at Brookline High School. Rebecca and I were sitting this afternoon talking about Margaret, and Rebecca mentioned to me witnessing some of Margaret's brilliance, some of her idiosyncrasies, some of the things that Tel was referencing, I think, earlier. But what Rebecca stressed to me was Margaret's kindness. Margaret pulling her out in the hallway to tell her about what a good job she'd done with a lesson, or working with her on an article that Rebecca was writing for English Journal on Tess of the D'Urbervilles, including the line, I think it was, that she wished she had written that piece. I think after she hears Rebecca's piece today, Margaret would have said the same thing. Rebecca, come on up.
I've been teaching for 30 years and have 5 to go. Recently, I've been ruminating a lot about my remaining time in this profession I love, one I worked long and hard to get established in. I can't imagine any other career once I had given up fleeting and ridiculous notions of singing or acting. When those 5 years are up, will I be ready to say goodbye? Now I've been granted the privilege of writing 1,600 words about the absorbing, demanding, complex, messy, wonderful practice of this thing we call teaching. 1,600 words. I suppose I could dispense bits of wisdom and practical tips I've accumulated over the years. Read with your head and your heart. There is no excuse for boring writing, ever. Analytical writing is not cold. Write feelingly about your ideas. And my all-purpose mantra for working with a difficult student: disengage, grade accordingly, this too shall pass. But I'm not feeling particularly wise right now. In fact, I'm feeling pretty raw. No Olympian calm or equanimity for me. I'm still traversing the lower peaks and valleys. So I'll start with an image I can't get out of my head. Every morning when I get to school, I come down the third-floor hallway and approach the picnic table around the corner from my office. The view from this particular spot is lovely. BHS is graced with huge windows. We're lucky that way. And from here you can see our quad. A huge 3-story high dogwood fills the window panes. There's lots of sky, and if you look down, you can see bushes, benches, and statues. And every morning, the shades have been pulled down, blocking out the sky, the sun, the light. And every morning, I feel a surge of anger in my belly. I know why they are down. The bright light streaming in makes it impossible for students to see the screens on their phones, iPads, and laptops, so they pull down the shades. And in fact, a few early birds are already sitting there. It's about 7:30, their eyes fixed on whatever device is in front of them. School hasn't even begun, and I'm already in a rage. I can't seem to view this little vignette in anything other than big picture end of civilization terms. How we're cut off from nature, cut off from each other, cut off from quiet time and reflection. How the world has become what's on our screens rather than what is in front of our noses, here and now. I want to see kids staring out that window, watching the birds on the dogwood tree. I want to see them chatting with friends, working through a math problem, indulging in semi-inappropriate public displays of affection. Even, is it too much to ask, reading a book? And then my mind jumps forward to my approaching B-Block freshman class. They will be clumped outside room 410, waiting for English. If I'm lucky, once every couple of weeks, Naomi will be absorbed in her newest Jodi Picoult novel. But otherwise, 99% of the group will be on their phones, in complete silence. No one will come into the classroom early to chat with me as I set up for the day. My absolutely no cell phones policy has turned me into the dragon in its lair. Wow, do I feel lonely. Some days I'm not sure I'll last out even another year. My daily obstacle course through the halls is a fresh stab wound. It seems as if 99 out of 100 students are on their phones or plugged into their earbuds. I simply cannot inure myself to this. The atmosphere feels hyper, unfocused, wired, and don't even get me started on the corporate greed underpinning all of this. What scares me the most is wondering if the kids even know what they're missing. Do they fall into books the way I did at their age, inhabiting them so entirely that to be called back to the present was like waking up? Do they walk around the neighborhood listening to the breezes, observing the changing seasons, daydreaming, following their own thoughts? Do they actually chat with their mom and dad on their daily drives to school? I can't help but connect this collective digital addiction to my own frustrations in the classroom. My students read less and with less comprehension, intensity, and focus. Their vocabulary is diminishing. When I ask, who considers yourselves a bookworm? Or who read a good book over vacation? Often no one raises their hand. And how much are we educators to blame for this? Why is reading now often thought of as mere homework, i.e., busy work? Why are we afraid to ask kids to read more? Why do we no longer expect our students to read the hard classics, to look for universality in literature, to see how we all connect? Am I alone in believing that the canon is worth not only expanding, but preserving? It's painful to find myself feeling like a conservative crank, me with my hippie upbringing and left-wing politics. But it seems now if I defend a common culture identity through literature, I'm viewed as a washed-up, politically suspect, pathetic throwback. Maybe I'm not so much a dragon as a dinosaur. But then on other days, the thought of leaving the classroom makes me so sad, I can barely imagine it. Where do I feel more alive, more engaged, more energized, more privileged, more myself? Where else than in the classroom do students raise their internal shades of their own unguarded selves? There are so many magic moments. Daniel and Tim, both on the young side of 9th grade, and real boys soccer players, act out Beatrice and Benedict's confession of love scene for Much Ado About Nothing, giving it their sweet, unironic all. Iris announces after finishing Hamlet that the young prince is a spoiled brat, and the class erupts. They can't stop arguing, even after our time is up. Ella, who has refused to say a word in any discussions all year, takes command of her group, Tess of the D'Urbervilles Project, and is a force, presenting beautifully and confidently. My D-Block freshmen are scattered around the floor, playing their homemade Odyssey board games, totally absorbed, not a cell phone in sight. I cherish those moments. My students' unguarded selves can also send desperate SOS flares up and out of their essays. There was Emma, always tight-lipped and laconic in our personal interactions, who wrote about her fears of becoming like her suicidal father, and who needed to be escorted from my classroom to the waiting ambulance because her anorexia had become life-threatening. When she was in my class again 2 years later, she wrote about living alone in an apartment. I ran to her guidance counselor with the essay, who then ran to a social worker, who then called DCF, and that evening her mother was called into school and charged with neglect. Emma's thank you note when she graduated, delivered, as always, with an impassive nod, was so passionately grateful, I was undone. Other confessions or revelations stay with me. Lily wrote of her deep loneliness moving from China to Queens, New York, where her parents locked her in her bedroom. Cindy wrote in a Family Secrets essay that her father revealed that both his parents had been sexually abused as children. Henry reported that his father slapped him at the dinner table if he spoke English. The mess and muck of adolescence just spills out onto the page. It is a scary, beautiful privilege to be the recipient of all those open-hearted calls for connection. Years later, I still miss my students. I hope Emma is writing her volcanic personal narratives, but now with a measure of forgiveness and compassion. That Lily is the nurse she set out to be, to put, quote, love into action, as her college essay so beautifully described it. That Cindy smiles more than she used to, and that Henry gently reminds his own son to speak Chinese at the dinner table. Sometimes I am so overwhelmed by these kids' rich, full, complex selves, and I wish them so intently all the best in the world, I'm blindsided. I have stood in front of a group of freshmen, quietly taking a vocabulary quiz, just watching them cross off their words and fill in the blanks, and felt such a surge of love, my eyes have suddenly and unexpectedly welled up. Is this next moment too private to share? Maybe. But really, it pretty much encapsulates what I'm trying to say. A few years back, I sought counseling for help managing the intractable stress and worry that come from having a mentally ill, homeless brother. In the inevitably wide-ranging discussions those counseling sessions took, the only time I burst into anguished tears was when I expressed grief at losing my profession, both because I felt what I loved about it was slipping away, and because I inevitably would have to bid it goodbye. And now I stare into the future. It's June 2024. I turn off the lights, pull down the shades, and leave my classroom one last time. Do I feel relief or grief? I'll just have to see. But my hunch is that, as every English teacher knows, those of us who dwell in the realm not of either or, but of both and, the answer will be yes. Thank you.
This piece is called The Gents. Stunned silence is not a term generally used to describe the aura inside of a soccer mom minivan driven by a social worker, seats filled with 8 teenage boys, arriving at the Boston Garden to watch the Celtics take on the Denver Nuggets. But the term perfectly describes what descended upon the Honda Odyssey after Miguel's shocking utterance. "Yo, what city is this in?" he asked, with the same genuinely inquisitive tone I might have used to ask, "Who's the point guard for Denver?" The stunned silence lasted about 3 full seconds, a long time when you think about it. 7 other gents, and Miguel too actually, and 1 social worker, paused and sat quietly, considering the question. I remember looking up during those 3 seconds as we pulled into the underground parking garage and seeing a massive green and yellow neon sign on the side of the arena, Boston Garden. To say that Miguel got roasted for a prolonged stretch, starting with the 4th second, would be a massive understatement. "Look at the sign, bro. Boston Garden, fool. Boston. What the fuck city you think this is, New York?" Tyrone, not surprisingly the first to speak, addressed the friend he basically considered a brother. He pretty adequately expressed what everyone else in the van was thinking. Miguel, who knew the moment the question left his lips that he had committed an epic blunder, tried some damage control. No, chill. I meant, like, where is this? Like, what hood? Where in the city is? But it was too late. Way too late. "Yo, gents, what city are the Denver Nuggets from?" "How fucking dumb are you, bro? What kind of car is this Honda Odyssey?" "Miguel, you need help, my man." The first rule of the gents is that you get roasted pretty much every time you open your mouth. The second rule of the gents is that you get roasted pretty much every time you open your mouth, even when making a valid point about why chance can wrap circles around little Uzi Vert. And Miguel, with his penchant for malapropisms, was on the receiving end of most of the verbal abuse. Like the time I brought in a buddy who plays professional poker to teach the gents the vital life skill of Texas Hold'em. After an hour of lessons and open play, we were ready for our first live hand. I'd wager that this will go down in history as the worst hand of poker ever played. Insane bets, inappropriate folds, ludicrous trash talk, and blatant cheating all culminated with Miguel being the last to reveal his cards. With a boastful, shit-eating grin, he aggressively slapped his hand down on the table. Antoine was showing a straight, Cedric 2 pair, and Reggie a full house. "Give me those chips, bitches, they're mine, all mine." Again with the stunned silence. He had a pair of 3s. I loved watching his wonderfully expressive and soulful face through all the phases of the process. Realization he just said something dumb. Eyes get slightly bigger and rounder, lips close at lightning speed, head swivels as if suddenly interested in the time where the gum stuck to the table. First wave of abuse. Eyes narrow, lips purse, shaking his head just perceptibly. Second wave of abuse. Nostrils flare, deep exhale, brow furrows. Then, finally, just as I ready myself to jump out of my seat to break up a potential brawl, the smile. The shiny white teeth appearing and restoring tranquility and brotherhood. My B. The moments of levity, which seemed to materialize with roughly the same frequency as our breathing, were interspersed with occasional flashpoints of deeper connection. Each of the 8 boys was a gent for a reason. Yes, I had handpicked the members, and they in fact had known each other for many years, some having even been kindergarten classmates. But there were other unifying threads that uniquely qualified them to be in the group. Most of the boys did not live with their fathers or even have what could be called a meaningful relationship with them. Most of them lived in public housing and subsisted on a single income from their mothers that fell woefully short of meeting all but their most basic needs. Most had a long history of struggling mightily in school. All were on IEPs and had been placed in special education classes for years. As if these challenging circumstances weren't enough of a burden, the gents had also experienced more than their share of additional hardship. Tyrone's father had passed away a year ago after suffering the progressively horrific ravages of end-stage diabetes. He came dangerously close to losing his mother the next year when she suffered a serious health issue and ended up in the ICU at Mass General, the same hospital where she worked. Cedric's family had been evicted from public housing for non-payment of rent. His well-meaning but overwhelmed and under-resourced mother unable to navigate the systems that could and should have prevented this scarring outcome. Homeless by anybody's definition, he and his family spent years bouncing around several different living arrangements. Reggie's challenge was more outwardly apparent. A complication at birth, he was a twin, had impacted his development. He used crutches, his mobility and cognition compromised from his earliest moments. He emigrated from Haiti at 12. Reggie struggled socially, feeling isolated and trapped within his grindingly limiting routine of home, school, home, transport by van, video games and TV playing an increasingly outsized role during his out-of-school hours. This year, he had faced the additional burden of his twin sister battling a crippling depression, which resulted in multiple long-term hospitalizations. Of course, in my one-on-one talks with the boys, and less often in group settings, the age-old insecurities, angst producers, and emotional albatrosses of adolescence poked their heads out from under the armor of their testosterone-coated machismo. 2 of the boys teetered on the brink of obesity. A soccer coach's cruel comment to Antoine after he finished last in wind sprints, or my own blunder of ordering 2X, not 3X t-shirts with the gents logo for Big Eddie, laid bare their pain and disappointment with their bodies changing in a way they didn't want to accept. In incremental steps, Stephen, a handsome, popular, and gregarious middle child with 6 S-named siblings, began to disclose the anxiety that lay at the root of the negative student behaviors which to that point had led many to read him as willfully intransigent, apathetic, and lazy. The school year flew by as it does, and the gents all sensed that their high school careers wouldn't be the only things ending in May. Our bi-weekly meeting schedule had been routine for months, but the frequency with which I received off-week texts, "We meeting tonight? Yo, when's our next meeting?" revealed that their mixed feelings about the group's inevitable parting. I knew it would be important for the gents to have some sort of culminating element to the journey we had been on together. I had pitched the idea of an overnight camping adventure on the Harbor Islands. I brought my own children there every year and cherished the memories of our weekend adventures exploring our own idyllic urban island. Let's just say the gents were more into CVS than REI. The idea was hastily shot down. In fact, they had been scheming and caucusing without me. Chicago, we are going to Chicago. My brother Theo had planted this seed during a special gents dinner over Christmas break, and apparently it had germinated. As I emailed back and forth with Theo's assistant to plan the trip's logistics, I couldn't help but think back. At our second meeting, I asked the original 7 if they would consider adding a final 8th gent. Reggie needed the group, and I think the group needed him. They didn't hesitate. Reggie's our boy. He's in. A first icebreaker to get them talking. Over Chinese food, I asked them to tell me their middle names and the meaning behind them. Stephen nervously chuckled. He fidgeted in his seat, avoided eye contact. After much coaxing, he spoke. All right, check this out. It's Native American. It's kind of hard to pronounce. It's like another language. He then proceeded to enunciate his middle name. The other gents and I thought he was choking on a boneless spare rib. We'd never laughed so hard. When I revealed my middle name, Philip, he was my grandfather, but I never got to meet him. Miguel raised both of his arms triumphantly over his head and let out a whoop like he had just sunk a buzzer beater. That's my middle name, too. There were things I only found out later, like that when Lyle drove half of the gents to our dinner at a Brighton steakhouse, he possessed neither a license nor a permit. Or that CVS's in Chicago sell beer, and they remain open past the hour when social workers are asleep in their hotel rooms. Cut to the tarmac at Logan. Miraculously, we are all on board. I had assigned 4 different gents the task of waking up Stephen on time. But it was yours truly who had accidentally thrown away his boarding pass with his Dunkin' Donuts cup after clearing security. For many of the gents, this would be their first ever flight. Tyrone, 1 seat behind me, kept squeezing my shoulder really hard and repeating, "Yo, I'm shook, I'm shook." The truth was that I was shook too, almost shaking, with a feeling that had percolated all year, but was now bubbling up and over my surface. It was love for these 8 young men, individually and collectively. The engine started to rev, the plane began to move forward. We were ready for takeoff.
In the 1980s, Margaret Metzger developed a course at Brookline High School called Writing as Discovery, which the town let her do. They gave her a sabbatical to work on it. Those were the days. Recently, a current English teacher pulled me aside to say he'd found this curriculum in our book room called Writing as Discovery, and that he was using all these lessons that Margaret wrote back in the 80s. They're still working. They're just as effective now as they were. For Lauren Ockene, I think this summer writing was a process of discovery, as it was for all of us. And we learned through writing and rewriting and talking and sharing what it is that we wanted to say. I'm glad I can share with you today Lauren Ockene's story.
Is that all right? You can hear me? Teacher voice. I told John I was a little unsure about going after Paul's awesome, beautiful story. But both of my daughters had John Andrews as a teacher, and I got to work with him this summer, and I know how thoughtful and deliberate and smart he is, and so I know there must be a reason, and I'm going to go ahead. My story is called Taking Stock. April vacation came to an end. Sorry. Thank you. April vacation came to an end. I looked finally toward June. It hit me that I had not fulfilled my commitments to myself, and I wondered why I had slipped so badly. In August, I had told myself that I would find pieces of the vast curriculum requirements that I could let go, that in their stead I would do what I love, the teaching that my students have learned and grown from, the real-life outdoor science, the authentic writing, and sometimes the ushering of preteens into our beautiful democracy. During my years of teaching 4th and 5th grade, I had created units and activities that kept the students and myself learning and excited. In my bird migration unit, the fourth graders designed, raised money for, and planted a large garden of shrubs and trees, all chosen to meet the needs of winged migrants. I'd built raised beds at the antique devotion house with my students and a volunteer dad, where soon after my 9 and 10-year-olds planted colonial food crops. I had said yes to them crafting letters about pending climate legislation in the State House, and they had excitedly received letters back from their representatives. I'd supported teams of kids weighing food waste in our cafeteria as a composting trial run and presenting their data to the town's Solid Waste Advisory Committee. I had observed Saul, who dealt with significant learning challenges and gender identity questions, who was silent to the core in the classroom, and who became a steady and gentle garden volunteer at recess. I'd witnessed him stepping up confidently when my colleague asked for someone to show her class around the schoolyard garden, leaving me grinning in awe. And now this year, in the 5th grade, my teaching tasks included a science curriculum all about birds and an energy unit that I thought I could amend to focus on climate change. These were up my alley, really. I did a few short-term projects, including the design and building of solar ovens and maintaining a class worm bin for snack waste. In the ornithology unit, we danced around some citizen science, but I really succumbed to the research project that my colleagues shared with me, a project that was solid and engaging, but that I knew would take the time I would need if my students were to dig into real inquiry. The year's journey didn't start badly. As always, my students had wonderful qualities and diverse personalities. The class had some very energetic children and more than a few calm, thoughtful ones. As a whole, they worked hard when there was a task in front of them, and there were a couple of high points in the first few weeks where I felt like the group was becoming a community of learners, positive and engaged. Things moved along reasonably peacefully during each densely packed school day, yet I began to feel the waters rising steadily around me. After school, I would finally visit my desk, gearing up for the long hours ahead, the planning of instruction for 5 different subjects tomorrow. My new colleagues were, as a group, the most generous I'd ever had, sharing and explaining patiently whenever I asked them to. Yet the preparation for each day of unfamiliar curriculum was still huge. The pile of student work to read claimed more and more of my space at home and at school, and the dynamics in the class took a dive. One student's increasingly disruptive actions were met with apparent admiration and then aspiring mimicry by loyal friends. After a few weeks of trying unsuccessfully to address these behaviors, more of my preteens seemed to gain license in disrespect and defiance. Parent defensiveness, lack of trust, and even aggression hit a new high for me after 2.5 decades of teaching. A few students boldly informed me, "We don't like when you email our parents." Phrases like, "Why don't we get to?" and "But why can't we?" overshadowed the quiet trickle of enthusiasm and openness to new learning. I spent hours documenting disruptive behaviors and my efforts to change them, meeting with our guidance counselor, school administrators, and the school psychologist. I even tried marble jars, a real one and a giant one made of orange Velcro dots. Don't ask. Complete with student-chosen rewards like a trip to the teen center, earned upon filling the jars. The tone barely improved. Being a self-contained classroom teacher had always been a too-big job, involving many evening and weekend hours, and even more so in the last few years as the tasks around assessing students increased, the online reports grew full of minute and immeasurable criteria, and the meetings and email expectations burgeoned. But a critical mass of poor student and sometimes parent behavior was an added layer of stress that rapidly impacted my life. By late November, I was waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning, unable to fall back asleep. Students who seemed to see their authority as equal to mine on my mind. A sinking feeling, fleeting authority, a loss of potential, goals and expectations unmet. And my exhaustion was not helping with classroom management. The classroom community felt like it was spinning out of control. Math felt like a social hour. Scientific drawing became playful doodling. Students transitioned back to their desks as if strolling on the beach. I could see in morning meeting that a handful of my most rule-abiding, kind students did not feel enough trust in the class to share their interests or their stories. Defiance and disrespect felt like our class MO. This was the first year where I didn't begin signing my morning message with "Love, Ms. Ockene" at some point in the winter. Not because I didn't love them, but because I didn't want to hear the murmurs and snickers that I knew would follow. One morning in March, Yunji shared that she'd gone to a farm in New Hampshire where she saw maple sugaring. I told the class that for many years I had tapped Coolidge Corner maple trees with my 4th graders. Students shouted, "Can we do that?" in hopeful voices. I told them that I was sorry, but we had done it as part of the botany unit, a 5th grade unit. Thinking it over at my desk after school, I remembered some of what I had facilitated. Students gathered around a tree, identifying it as red, sugar, or silver maple by the shape and color of its buds, a pair of them wrapping a tailor's tape around the trunk to see if we could tap this tree. The powerful stance of tiny Rona, using the old-fashioned hand drill, and then coaching her friend on how to position her body so that the bit would take hold. The buzz and shouts of excitement as shreds of wood started to fall away, and the absolute thrill of the first drops of sap sliding out. Ethan shouting, "Oh my God, no way, the hole is actually dripping." Hands curved to form cups under the spile, collecting watery drops, tasting the sweetness made in last year's leaves and cached deep in the roots. Me taking an energetic little crew of students outside after school every day, everyone vying for a chance to carry the measuring cups and empty milk jugs we'd use to collect and measure our liquid bounty. Children trotting out of the building with my student teacher after lunch to measure the air temperature and to see last night's low on the very cool thermometer that we had hidden in the bushes. I taught maple trees with my 4th graders for 10 years. Each year was different, yet the kids always came out of the experience with new understandings, new questions about nature and science, and a memory of excitement and wonder that the students and their parents continue to mention to me years later. Sitting at the rug with my 5th graders, I knew that I hadn't denied them tapping the trees simply because botany was a 4th grade unit. I could have created a different version of maple sugaring to teach 5th grade math skills, for sure. I could have, if there was a critical mass of students who I knew would rise to the occasion and behave responsibly outdoors. I could have if I hadn't been so drained by disrespect in behavior and attitude. I could have if I'd had the trust of all the parents, or at least reasonable assurance of civility from everyone. I could have if my days weren't already quite so long and full with all that I had to do as a classroom teacher. Thankfully, this is a different year. I've become an English language educator, and I have the pleasure of working with small groups of English learners. I've started learning about shared writing and early literacy. And last week I took a stab at writing one sentence about our picture sorting activity together with 8 bouncy 5-year-olds. This week I had time to meet with a parent garden volunteer about what we might grow and what activities my 4th graders and kindergartners might do in the garden. I look forward to doing more shared writing that spins off of our outdoor discoveries this fall. April vacation is far away, and I believe I will be happy to look back once I get there.
Teaching is full of small moments collected over time. There was the moment that Ryan, a 2nd grader with autism, stripped during recess, streaked across the lower field, and cackled as I ran like my pants were on fire to catch and cover him. The moment that Manny ran away from school to avoid a math test he hadn't studied for, as the sheriff's helicopter bellowed his name from overhead, and police officers swarmed our campus. The moment that Elizabeth, a young girl with selective mutism, stole the show by singing her very heart out at the holiday concert for the very first time. And of course, the moment an erratic homeless guy wandered onto school property, screaming at the outdoor shed, "I know you're in there, Obama," as I attempted to keep my students focused on our geometry lesson. But the moment that truly transformed my teaching career occurred in November 2000, my first year as an educator. I was 22 years old, green, and ready to take on the world. Early one morning, I entered the school's conference room with my head held high, ready for my first special education or IEP meeting. Under my arm, I carried my masterpiece, a collection of student work samples and graphs of academic data. I greeted my student's mother, Mrs. King, warmly and took a seat across from her. The distance between us felt wide. Her hand was damp, her handshake weak, her smile barely noticeable. "Looks like we're off to a great start," I thought sarcastically. We began with introductions and general information about Elizabeth. My teammates and I shared the results of her recent academic evaluations. Spreading out Elizabeth's work samples and data on the table, I beamed with pride. As my part of the meeting drew to a close, I summarized my assessment by stating, "Elizabeth has not made adequate progress in the classroom. These evaluations confirm that for us. She does, in fact, qualify for an individualized education plan due to the discrepancy between her achievement scores and cognitive ability. Factual, concise, direct, professional. In my mind, I high-fived myself for a job well done. My first IEP meeting had been a success. I glanced over at Mrs. King, anxiously awaiting her approval. But instead, tears streamed down her face. Puzzled, I leaned over and rested my hand on hers. "Are you okay?" I whispered. To my amazement, she quickly pulled her hand away, muttering, "Well, good for you. Hooray for you and your testing." She paused, glared at me, and declared, it gets me every time, "Until you are a parent and you sit on this side of the table, you will never understand what it is like to discover that you have a child with special needs." Words escaped me. I was stunned. And then I was annoyed. How was she not amazed by my preparedness, my eloquence, my brilliance as an educator? I had worked hard, spent hours preparing my lesson plans each week, volunteered for and participated in every committee imaginable, examined student data, collaborated with colleagues to discuss the results, was always friendly towards others and enthusiastic about teaching, sent newsletters home about our classroom lessons and events. Wasn't that enough? I allowed myself a few minutes, hours, and days to process her words. Then I began to wonder what an IEP meeting must have been like from her perspective. Maybe she was right. After all, I wasn't a parent. Maybe being on the other side of the table was challenging. Perhaps my words, presented so matter-of-factly, needed some fine-tuning. I imagined Mrs. King creating her greatest artistic masterpiece, just as I had with my data, pouring time and energy and love into it as it evolved. I pictured Mrs. King proudly bringing this masterpiece to an art gallery where guests took turns pointing out its flaws. And then I saw Elizabeth. Elizabeth was her masterpiece. And I had been the guest pointing out the flaws. I reflected on what it would be like to have others critique my masterpiece, picking apart my work without any regard for the time that had been spent creating it. And over time, my perspective changed. For almost 20 years now, parents have entrusted me with their beautiful masterpieces. Each time I am gifted with a new piece, I spend time examining the rich colors, highlighting the positive features and asking questions. I listen to the trials and triumphs involved in creating a work of art like that. I learn about the time and energy that was spent making it. I try to understand the hidden meanings and the ways that the initial idea for the project may not have gone as planned. I fast forward to October 2019. I am 41 years old. I enter the conference room with my head held high, ready for my next meeting. "Tell me about Peter, Mrs. Martin," I say. Miss Martin begins. I've been concerned about him lately. It doesn't seem like he has any friends at school. She chokes up. I listen intently, picturing Pete. I rest my hand on her shoulder and assure her, it's still early in the year. She smiles. She doesn't pull away. I am gentler with my responses, selective about the words I choose. I stop and think now, what would Mrs. King need from me in this moment? And this time it's different. This time, instead of sitting across from Mrs. Martin, I sit beside her.
The last piece today comes from Evan Mousseau, another English teacher from Brookline High School, and I'm just going to let him tell his story.
I did not want to be a gay teacher. In a graduate school adolescent development class, we read about the importance of sharing our authentic selves with our students. This connection would lead to more meaningful relationships, more student buy-in, more potential for real personal and academic growth. But where do we draw the line? I wondered aloud in a group discussion. Are there certain aspects of our lives that our students just don't need to know about? Aspects that would make some students disconnect, aspects that would open us up for ridicule behind our backs. I did not want to be a gay teacher. So, in my first year at BHS, when a lesson on the factors that make up and affect one's identity was to begin with students creating a list of the elements of their own identities, I left my sexual orientation off when I provided my own list as an example for them. I told a lie of omission. I am teaching them about reading and writing, I told myself. I am not teaching them about me. That would only distract from our collective mission, I justified. As the year progressed, though, I began to realize that maybe my concerns were ill-founded. I realized this when one of my ninth graders used his own homosexuality as part of his argument that the author of an article we had just read about gender was ill-informed, albeit well-meaning. And when John shared a personal essay about coming out as transgender that remains one of the most powerful pieces of student writing I have ever read. And when Melissa spoke with pride about her senior brother sharing his own story at Brookline High's annual LGBT-centered Day of Dialogue. In all of these events, I watched my students rally around each other, support each other, learn from each other. And as an educator, I knew that I wanted my students to learn these lessons from each other in this way. But I did not want them to have to learn these lessons from each other, simply because I had not been brave enough to teach them myself. I knew that I did not want to be a gay teacher. I knew that I had to be a gay teacher. And so, the following year, when I projected my identity on the board, there, among such factors as teacher, white male, son and brother, reader, movie and television fan, and crossword puzzle addict, was LGBT community member. My phrasing was vague and non-committal, yes, but remember, I did not want to be a gay teacher. As I read LGBT community member aloud, I made a cursory glance around the room. I saw a few questioning looks, some students glancing toward classmates as if to ask, "Did you know?" Or maybe I was just projecting my own anxieties on the moment. There were, after all, far more students whose engagement level was no greater than it had been the previous day when we were looking at a list of common prepositions. Emboldened, I even ventured toward a vague introduction to intersectionality, making an offhanded comment about how some of these factors interacted to shape others. My sexuality and upper middle class status, I said, likely played a factor in my moderately liberal politics. A few nodded in understanding. Ben tentatively raised his hand. I braced for a question that might spotlight my own discomfort, while nodding for him to share what was on his mind. So, how many crosswords do you do that it's like part of your identity? And like that, we were moving on. Students were off and writing lists about their own identities. The spotlight shifted away from me. My students, their thoughts, and their work were center stage once more, as I knew it should be. I'm not going to ask you to share this list with anyone, I told them as they began to write. Not even with me. It's just a tool for you to think about who you are and how that might influence how you see the world. If I had learned anything from sharing my authentic self with my students, it was that it was hard to do. I could not ask for vulnerable introspection and impromptu extroversion all at once. It had, after all, taken me a year to share my own honest list. It would take nearly as long for me to know whether my own sharing had had any impact at all on my students. At the end of each school year, students complete a reflection, looking back over their year and offering me feedback to improve my own practices in the future. They rate the books we read, the pieces we wrote, and circle their yes, somewhat, no responses to prompts like, my reading skills improved, my knowledge and understanding of the subject matter increased, my teacher was generally prepared. Finally, there is a series of open-ended questions leading to the most open-ended of all. Any additional comments or feedback you'd like me to know? Each year, I wait until partway through July to read these. I want to give myself some personal and professional distance from the year. I want to give myself a break before getting back into the mental space of the classroom. I began flipping through my ninth graders' reflections at my dining room table in the afternoon humidity, and patterns began to emerge. Students universally loved To Kill a Mockingbird. Boys liked Lord of the Flies, while girls' reviews were more mixed. Creative and personal writing was preferred to writing literary analysis papers. Patterns, if not surprises. The patterns continued on through that final question. Any additional comments or feedback you'd like me to know? Most students simply left this blank. Several took the time to end with a quick, nope, I'm good. Or even what Hasty Chicken Scratch suggested maybe a somewhat insincere thanks. Then, a surprise. I came to Brendan's reflection. Kind, courteous, intelligent Brendan, who is the type of student that teachers love to teach. Brendan, who is first to arrive, last to leave, coming and going with a cheery good morning and a genuine thank you. Brendan, whose contributions to discussion each day were deep and thoughtful, and whose third quarter progress report I began with, oh, for a class full of Brendans. Brendan, whose additional comment or feedback that he'd like me to know was, thank you for sharing about your LGBT identity. It made me so much more comfortable with myself. I did not want to be a gay teacher, but for Brendan, I was. And it was something he very much needed at what I know firsthand to be a difficult time. I keep Brendan's course reflection in a folder of documents that remind me of my passion for and purpose in teaching. It reminds me that often those things that are hard to do, those things that leave us vulnerable, those things that we don't want to do, are the most important things to do. It also makes me wonder how my own high school experience might have been different if I had had an LGBT teacher share openly about who they were. I admit to finding this sort of revisionist personal history woefully speculative and self-indulgent, but difficult to resist. I don't know that my own coming out timeline would have changed, nor do I necessarily wish for that. But I knew, though, that it would have been helpful to see the promise of potential happiness, success, and normalcy in my future. I know that it would have, in the words of Brendan, made me feel so much more comfortable with myself. I still do not want to be a gay teacher. I hope that is not how all of my students and colleagues remember me. I hope to be the teacher with a giant classroom library who recommended just the right book. The teacher who emphasized that specificity is the soul of narrative in each and every writing lesson. The teacher with a Sisyphean commitment to summer reading. But I know there will be more students like Brendan, more students like me, more students who need me to be a gay teacher. And above all, I want to be remembered as the teacher that my students needed me to be.
Before I say goodbye and thank you all for coming one last time, I just want to remind you of something I've said before at one of these events, and then I'll probably say again before the year's out. When I was in graduate school with Elon Fisher and Margaret Metzger was our professor, she talked about a triangle of a teacher and a student and a content, and that the classroom is all about the intersection of that triangle. And at the very end of the class, on the last day, she reminded us, or told us for the very first time, and reminded us, that in the center of that triangle is love. I'm hoping you heard that in these stories today and over the last 5 years, and thank you very much.
I have to throw away my notes to ask you to recognize John Andrews now. I did want to just give a tiny little bit of history about this this event because it's really was so special. I'm told it took a few inspired meetings to imagine and launch the Metzger Fellowship in 2015, slated to run for 3 to 5 years. But honoring Margaret's legacy in this way required years of gifts from scores of donors, dedicated work by the Metzger committee members, and incredible mentoring by John, and even envisioning this night and the amazing way in which he weaves the stories together. So I'd like to recognize Barbara Kleeman, Mary Birchinell, Abby Erdman, Kathleen Sheehy, Ian Rothman, Katie Bacon, Elizabeth Ascoli, and our generous donors who support the professional growth and excellence of Brookline educators in the public schools year in and year out. Thank you very much. So, for his amazing and skillful leadership, he has something to drink when he gets home.